Good morning, Kamal. How are you doing today? So we'll start in 5 minutes. We'll just wait for others to join us. I am sounding a bit sick. I'm not sure if I am getting sick. So just bear with my voice today. I was coughing a little bit this morning.
That's fine, ma'am.
Good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? I'm feeling a little bit sick. My voice seems as though it's going. I hope it doesn't go, but we'll try to have the class today. So I do apologize for it. As you can hear, it doesn't sound too good at the moment. So let's get started. Okay, so today we're starting a new section in the textbook. We're on pages 103, and we're going to be talking about media and culture in South Africa, a South African perspective. Alrighty. So what are we going to do? So I think this this chapter of the textbook will take 2 lectures. So we're going to be covering pages 103 to 119. Let me just get some water. Okay. Yes, so pages 103 to 119. And we'll be talking about the history of culture studies, influences in different ways, post-colonialism, postmodernism, and post-feminism. So let's talk a little bit more about South Africa and our culture. As we know, South Africa is very culturally diverse. Okay, we have a very complex history. Okay, and for this reason, culture is very, very important in South Africa. It shapes the way we think about society, our opinion, our attitudes, and it also brings people together. Okay, where we develop our identities, our political views, how we view the rest of the world. I know that being South African, when I went overseas, it was so difficult because of our culture and the way we are integrated with different races, different opinions, different ways of thinking. And it's not always the same when you go abroad. So when it came to South Africa, there was a huge political shift, as some of you might know, in the 1990s, and it restructured South Africa in a way because apartheid came to an end and the first democratic election took place, as we know. So there was also an increase in globalization and advances in technology during this time. So there was a new way that the world emerged. There was new understandings coming about, a new consciousness in the way we live. Okay, and this also had a profound effect on the media and the way it relates into the context in which it was created, disseminated, and consumed. So the political events shaped our understanding of the world, and this also had an effect on the media. So what about the history of culture studies when it comes to academics? So academics tend to disagree about what the field of cultural studies is. Although the field of cultural studies is new, it's not the first attempt to understand human culture. So here we are trying to understand our culture, who we are, our place in society, etc. So anthropology and sociology focus on the influence of culture and social structures and communities, and cultural studies draws on elements of different disciplines, including sociology, anthropology, and its ability to formulate theories. Cultural studies is a field of analysis that focuses on the political and social dynamic of contemporary culture. It attempts to define the characteristics of culture and determine its historical foundations. So what are the historical foundations of a particular culture? How was it formed? What were the influences? Researchers in cultural studies examine how cultural practices are linked to wider systems of power and categories such as race, class, and gender. So these are very important parts of cultural practice. Cultural theories combine different political orientated approaches, including post-colonial studies, critical race theories, feminist theory, postmodernist theories, and post-structuralism, which we are going to get into today. Cultural studies considers social practice in order to understand how and why we adopt certain trends or ideas and reject others, why we gravitate towards certain groups and shy away from others, and how or why we perform our roles in society. So it's a very dynamic and interesting field of study to understand different cultures, how we interact with each other, who we are, okay, etc. Questions, comments?
No, ma'am.
No, so, yes? So in order to study our subcultures in South Africa, it's necessary to understand a bit more about some of the key theories in cultural studies. So we did touch on these theories in the last 2 or 3 weeks, okay? And we're going to get more into them today. So we're going to focus on post-colonialism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-feminism. So all of these theories begin with post, or the word post, and this implies that the theoretical movements were created in response to what came before. So there was a theory that came, that it was created, and this came after that. Okay, so it built on that theory. In some instances, it contradicted the initial theory. So the prefix post also suggests a new perspective on old ideas. In addition, it's worth considering all these movements formed in a globalized and technologically orientated world, as we said before, where the lines between continents, cultures, and societies are blurred. Okay, so we must remember that that's why globalization is increasingly important. Okay, so post-colonialism refers to broadly the period following Western colonialism. Okay, so colonialism was a period where Europeans colonized the world. And it's important to draw a distinction between the post-colonial period, okay, the colonial period, and a post-colonial theory as a critical aftermath. A temporal aftermath refers to an identifiable time period which begins when a previously colonized country is liberated from colonial rule. Okay, so a critical aftermath refers to ways of thinking about and critiquing colonialism and its legacies. Just give me a second, guys. So studies in post-colonialism rethink the way that people are presented in history, especially those who are oppressed by colonial powers and different types of imperialism. So in post-colonialism, we'll talk about the oppressed, the colonial powers, and how or what were the different types of imperialism. It also considers how these oppressed people resisted their oppression and how colonial powers helped to shape the post-colonial societies they emerged after they withdrew. So there's something called neocolonialism, just for your knowledge, and it talks about how these colonies, most of them are in Africa, but also South America as well. Actually, most countries were colonies, and how these colonies still have an effect on the countries that they colonized. So it also considers how these oppressed people resisted their oppression and how colonial powers helped to shape the post-colonial societies that emerged after they withdrew. In post-colonial studies, reader Ashcroft et al. Note, the term post-colonial is resonant with all the ambiguity and complexity of the many different cultural experiences it implicates, and it addresses all aspects of the colonial process from the beginning of colonial contact. Questions? So there we see a really wonderful picture, okay? And it says Afrique, which is Africa. There's obviously a French colonizer, and he's cutting Africa up into various pieces, which they did. So colonialism refers to the act of acquiring and setting up colonies. Imperialism refers to a policy of forcefully imposing a country's influence, customs, and power on a colonized country through military intervention or other means. Both imperialism and colonialism assumed many forms and impacted many diverse cultures and societies around the world, as I've just said. This means that processes of decolonization also assumes many forms. Two of the most notable periods of decolonization are the British disengagement from the Second Empire of the 19th and 20th centuries and the liberation movements of the 1960s and 1970s in Africa and other colonies. The liberation movements in Africa and elsewhere provided the foundations upon which the theories of post-colonialism first took their form, although their origins can be traced back even further. The process of thinking about or thinking through the political, cultural, and economic liberation that these movements set in helped to establish many of the principles of decolonization. These include, first of all, rewriting history to include the narratives of the colonized. So previously this was not there, okay? So initially we just had whatever the colonizer used to say to us or their views of how things were, but this changed in post-colonialism, where the views of the colonized were taken into account. Colonial histories were written by the colonizers and commonly portrayed the colonizer in heroic terms, while colonized people were often misinterpreted and marginalized, okay? So their views weren't given much thought, okay? And it was misrepresented. They weren't presented correctly. For example, in the British colonies, the dominant narrative represented the British colonizers as heroes who brought civilization to primitive lands. Yes, so we know they were looked upon as heroes because they brought their concept of civilization to Africa and the rest of the world, bringing us their religion, their clothing, their food, their culture, their language, okay? And in this way, they were thought of as heroic. The colonized native inhabitants of the country were in contrast portrayed as primitive and uncultured. Post-colonial writers and critics aim to correct these narratives by emphasizing the importance of a diverse cultural identity. And this is what we try to enforce mostly in Africa as well. Excuse me. This helps them to challenge narratives that portray European culture as the pinnacle of civilization. Questions, comments?
No, ma'am.
So finally, European colonizers often sought to erase indigenous cultures and languages in favor of their own, which we did speak about when we were talking about identity and the influence of English and other languages in Africa. In post-colonial societies, nationhood and nationalism tend to be cultivated around patriotic ideas of a nation's cultural, political, and social identity. Formerly oppressed people sought control not only over the territorial boundaries and economic forms established by imperial powers, but also over their culture, language, and history. So Tordorf identifies 4 common traits shared by former colonies in Africa that gained independence. Their stint under colonial rule was brief in comparison to their pre-colonial history. They were all ruled by one of the European colonial powers. They were economically poor and dependent on exports to international markets, and they all sought to establish an independent identity as a nation state, the realization of which was often complicated by the diversity of their population. So when thinking about the idea of post-colonialism in a South African context, it's important first to understand what post-apartheid means. Apartheid is a system of institutionalized racial segregation that defined the political and social landscape of South Africa from 1948 until the 1990s. So we all know there were different places, different areas, different things that different races could do in South Africa based on your skin color. The historical institution of apartheid and their transition to democracy that took place in 1924 set South Africa apart from other African countries. South Africa was the first colony to achieve independence from a European power. This was not, however, the end of the institutionalized colonial state. White minority rule continued and managed to persist through segregation legislation. After 1948, the ideology of segregation between the races was formally institutionalized as apartheid. In 1994, after years of liberation struggles and negotiation, South Africa held its first democratic election, and the ANC under Nelson Mandela took up governance of the country, and we had a new constitution, and we ended apartheid. Okay, so the period following the transition is referred to as post-apartheid. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of the rainbow nation. So before I speak about it, what do you guys think? Do you guys think that this idea of the rainbow nation is a reality in South Africa? Yes, Maki.
Ma'am, are you talking about in terms of how diverse we are, or
Not in terms of diversity. So it's linked to diversity, but has this idea of the rainbow nation is it realized in South Africa?
Oh,
Is it a true representation? When people say the rainbow nation, is it a true representation of South Africa? What do you think?
I think it is, ma'am, because I think like every province has its dominant people. Like, let's say Free State has Afrikaners, KZN has like Zulus and Indian people, Eastern Cape has Xhosa people. And I think it's shown like through the sports, where certain sports, certain cultural groups will prosper. So I think it is realized. It's just that in terms of like in the political view, it's not, because most of our parliaments are African people. So, but I think other than that, I think it is realized, man.
Okay. Anybody else would like to say something? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about it. Okay, so after 1994, South Africa became known as a rainbow nation, and this concept was created to represent the racial and cultural diversity of the country, whilst we were trying to, or they, whoever created the concept, were trying to promote unity. So people born during or after 1994 became known as the born-free segregation or generation. These terms define the post-apartheid era as an era free from oppression. However, in recent years, commentators have shifted their focus from the ideal of post-apartheid unity to a more traditionally post-colonial interrogation of the contemporary moment. So this idea of rainbowism and narratives of unity through diversity are being challenged by referring to persistent racial discrimination, lingering colonial legacies, and questions about land ownership. So we need to dissect how true is this rainbow nation? What about all the ideas of apartheid still lingering in South Africa, or ideas of income inequality, etc.? So we need to think about those things, okay, when it comes to South Africa, the rainbow nation, etc. So what about the idea of culture? So the term culture is not easily defined. Why do you think it's not easily defined?
Because its meaning depends on context.
Good. Okay, so its meaning depends on context. Thanks for reading the first line for me. So what this means is that culture is socially constructed. So it develops when a group of people live together and form beliefs of tradition, and it changes as those beliefs and traditions change. So two of the most important aspects of culture are the ability of human beings to construct, to build, and the ability to use language. Communication, invention, and reinvention are crucial to the formation of cultures. Cultures are not static. They are constantly changing, okay? It always depends on the context of how it is being developed and changes. And there are many different types of influences. So they are influenced by particular socio-political moments in time, but they in turn also influence the material circumstances in which they are embedded. If we accept the idea that cultures are shaped by the circumstances which they emerge, then the concept of hybridity in post-colonial theory becomes a useful tool for thinking through the effect of colonialism on culture. In post-colonial discourse, hybridity commonly refers to the mixing of different cultures and the ways that Western culture have influenced Indian or African societies and vice versa. So we did speak a little bit about this when we were talking about globalization and the effect of Western cultures on our culture, African societies, Indian societies, all different types of societies, etc. Questions or comments? Okay, and we did say that it becomes a hybrid because it's a mix. And we all know this because we all sort of adopt this kind of culture. We dress Westernly, but we also still have our own African or Indian culture, etc. So South Africa was a country that was built through the hardships of violent struggle. In post-apartheid South Africa, culture has taken on a new significance. African cultures that were suppressed by the apartheid governments are now recognized and openly practiced. New cultures and subcultures have emerged. We can see the country as a space alive with possibilities for invention and reinvention, both culturally and politically. British and Dutch colonialism have transformed or eroded many of the traditional cultures of pre-colonial times. Yes, so they've changed it enormously. The apartheid government adopted and developed many of the oppressive institutions associated with imperial rule in order to construct the institutionalized racism and racial legislation that characterized its rule. In the 1980s and 1990s, as apartheid ended in South Africa, culture and cultural studies were largely preoccupied with resistance politics, okay? Because it means that they wanted to go against the racism and racial segregation that was occurring in the country. As South Africa made the transition to democracy, the idea of resistance and reinvention was central to imagining a new way of navigating an integrated, racially and culturally diverse population. Okay, so this is the idea where now we were all mixing together. After the year 2000, a shift in South African cultural studies suggested that we were moving away from politics of resistance to one of potential, as the country began to imagine the future from a perspective of a democratic society. At the same time, new languages of resistance have emerged among the born-free generation as they begin to question the legacies they have inherited, as well as the effectiveness of the struggle of emancipation. So can you think of examples of the youth challenging these problematic inherited institutions? There's a wonderful picture there that will give you an idea. Anyone? So who remembers Rhodes Must Fall? And what was it about?
Ma'am, wasn't it when the students removed the statue of Cecil John Rhodes at the university?
Yes, so why did they remove it?
They felt like it was still like I won't say a form, but it still represented some type of I don't want to call it apartheid, but it was still oppressive.
Good.
To have, yeah.
Exactly. So it was still a form of apartheid, okay? So it was a lingering form of apartheid in South Africa, okay? And we were challenging these ideas and notions of these people who are oppressive to us that was still lingering in our society. And it still shaped the way people think. So a global conversation about race and racial inequality is taking place not only in previously colonized countries, but also in the African diaspora, referring to people who have left their home countries and moved abroad, whether by choice or by force. So here we're talking about post-colonialism and the globe. The African diaspora is a worldwide collective of people who are descended from African people. The diaspora has its origin in slavery and colonialism, which forcibly removed African people from their home countries and transported them to places like America, where they were treated like property and forced to work as slaves. In more recent years, the African diaspora has also come to refer to people who have immigrated from Africa to other parts of the world. Questions, comments? No? Okay. So let's move on. So let's talk a little bit more about postmodernism. And we are talking about these theories quite a bit, so you can get more understanding of what they are and the application of them into media studies. So postmodernism refers to a theoretical movement that originated in the late 20th century. It's characterized by its interrogation of the established concept of reason. Okay. This is coupled to a critique of ideology and the role that ideology plays in maintaining economic and political power. The lens through which people see the world is made up of different aspects, including their culture, beliefs, and values. A critique of ideology looks at the ways in which these different elements are constructed or maintained. Such a critique also seeks to understand the role that these elements play in how people construct and interact with their social and political circumstances. While the exact date of origin of the postmodern movement is debated, we can roughly trace its beginnings to the end of the Second World War. However, it only achieved large-scale popularity in the 1960s. Postmodernists reject all notions of universal truth, dismiss more conventional empirical approaches to understanding society, and firmly believe that rationality was inherently a misleading concept. Postmodernism as a set of ideas is largely a reaction to the values and ideas of the modern period of Western and more specifically European history. The modern period occurs roughly from the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century to the mid-20th century. Technology brought about the Industrial Revolution and then resulted in the expansion of cities and industry. More and more people moved from the country to the city in search of work, and the cultural period between the 19th and mid-20th century, modernism is also famous for experimentation of the arts. Modernist philosophy was centered on moving away from traditional and classical values. Okay, so people were becoming more modernized. As you can see, there's a wonderful picture there, looking at modernity. So the term modern, yes?
But why is it called postmodernism? Like, doesn't it make like it isn't supposed to be like modernism because we're still living in it?
No, because
doesn't
remember,
it be like after?
So remember, when we talk about anything that's post, it's a theory that came after the initial theory. Okay, so feminism was a theory, we're still living in feminism, but feminism has changed. Okay, just to put it into context for you. So there was an ideology or a theory that was formed, and the post theory is a theory that's built upon the previous one, okay? Or it included some changes, etc. Okay, Tando? So that's why we call it postmodernism or post-feminism or post-Marxism. It's a build-up on the initial theory.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay. So the term modern refers to many different periods throughout history and implies a contrast between a recent period and an earlier period. Modernity implies progress moving forward and is most often associated with the 19th century world of political democracy, capitalism, urbanization, mass literacy, the mass media, anti-traditionalism, and so on. Let me just drink some water. Please bear with me. I'm not, my voice is really bad today. I'm quite ill, I think. And maybe it's the weather. So now we're just basically explaining modernism and postmodernism. So modernism refers to a movement in the creative arts that challenged what was considered acceptable fixed forms of art and literature by using new experimental forms and new mediums to better represent the chaos of the modern condition in an increasingly industrializing and globalizing world. Okay, so the world was changing and the way we projected art, cinema or plays or theater, etc., were changing as well to be representative of this changing and globalizing world. So what is modern? Modern is the current age, which is different from the historical period that has come before, contemporary time or history. Modernity, the progress made in the 19th and 20th century social, political, and technological areas, for example, mass media, democracy, and capitalism. Okay, so look at the different terms. And modernism is a movement in the creative arts that challenged existing norms, used experimental forms, and explored the chaos of the modern world. Questions?
No, ma'am.
So let's talk a little bit more about modernism and postmodernism. While modernism still believed in the value of rational thinking, science, and reason, postmodernism, so remember guys, when I taught you about these theories, if you have been attending my lectures, we can say in most often there's some kind of contradiction between the first or initial theory and its post form. So here we can see that postmodernism believed in the irrationality and incoherence of the everyday. Okay, so there was a contrast. Modernists advocated a distinction between high art and pop culture, while the postmodernists blurred the boundaries between what could and could not be considered art. Modernists also believed that there was a connection between the past and the present, and that life could be viewed objectively from the standpoint of universal truths and ethics. Postmodernists, on the other hand, saw no connection between the past and the present and believed that past events are essentially irrelevant to how we perceive the present. Postmodernists argued that the scientific, guys, let's go into the second lecture. It's going to end here. Okay, let me just give it to you if you don't have it. Please go into the other lecture and I'll meet you there. Okay, so as we were saying, we were going through the differences between modernism and postmodernism, okay? So postmodernists argued that the scientific world view and the notion of universal rational thought advocated during the modern period was often used to oppress and subjugate people. For example, the supposedly scientific field of eugenics argued that some people have better genetic qualities than others based on their facial features, skin color, and so on. Yes, this was definitely a thought that occurred during this kind of period. And it's not actually true. So in post-apartheid South Africa, postmodernist theory has proven useful in navigating new emerging cultural landscapes. Postmodernism recognizes that the world is made up of multiple and diverse cultures, and also promotes an increased awareness of the interests of minority groups, class struggle, and the drive toward both individual identities and group identities. Globalization and advancements in technology have also changed the way that we communicate with each other and interact with politics and society. Questions? Comments?
No. Yeah.
So what has been the effect of postmodernism on culture? In the postmodern movement, the function of culture evolved to occupy a more central position in the organization of present-day societies, whose contemporary culture can be at least in part characterized as postmodern. Postmodernism involves a dissolving of the boundaries not only between high and low cultures, but also between different cultural forms such as tourism, art, education, photography, television, music, sport, shopping, and architecture. We can see here that in culture, in the postmodern sense, has a very broad and varied definition. The term culture can take on a number of meanings. It can refer to the knowledge and characteristics of specific groups of people, including their religion, social habits, language, music, and art. It can also refer to shared patterns of behavior, beliefs, and interactions that are formed through socialization. So socialization basically means how we learn and acquire our habits, okay? More so through our family, our friends, etc., etc. The different places and contexts that we evolve. So while the early modern period was characterized by its promotion of a largely European idea of culture across the globe, postmodernism recognizes multiculturalism, the idea that the world is made up of many different cultures. In South Africa, recognizing multiculturalism was an important step in dismantling the legacy of apartheid. In an attempt to show recognition for South Africa's cultural diversity, the new government formally recognized 11 official languages, and the move toward nation building was joined to the idea of multiculturalism. And this created this idea of the rainbow nation. The idea of the rainbow nation is in many ways a postmodern one, since it has always been hard to define, and like many most postmodern concepts, remains ambiguous. Questions?
Ma'am, what can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes.
What do they mean that the concept of rainbow nation remains ambiguous?
Because this concept of the rainbow nation is, like I said to you previously, we need to think about it, and it's not always the way we think it is, because it's not realized. Okay. For example, we would like to think that we all get along in South Africa and all different races are happy living together, but that's not the truth. We have a lot of problems understanding different cultures and different races in South Africa. We have a problem integrating in different spaces. We know that there are political parties that are advocating more for African people and can come across as a little bit racist. Okay, so that's why it remains ambiguous. It's not fully understood and it's not fully realized the way that it should be.
Okay.
If you, I just want to check something here. Yeah, so I think it is in your textbook. I just want to see on what pages that it explains it a little bit better. So if you look at pages of 109, you'll see that it explains the roads must form movement. And then let's just see here. I think on one of the pages, it's going to explain it briefly to you, where it talks about that, like I'm saying to you, I know you had a very positive view of this Rainbow Nation, but we need to think about it, and if it's realized in South Africa, is this, yes, it's on page 114. So, oh, okay, we're still going to get into it actually, because when we talk about post-structuralism, but let's continue, and then when we get to post-structuralism, we'll talk more about the Rainbow Nation. Okay. Okay. So Afrofuturism. Who would like to take a guess? What is Afrofuturism? Like in the word itself.
Is it the future of Africa?
Well, yes, it's kind of linked to that. Let's get into it. So Afrofuturism is a cultural aesthetic as well as a philosophy of science and history that seeks to investigate and explore the connections between Africa and the African diaspora, culture, and technology. The Afrofuturist aesthetic combines elements of science fiction, Black history, and magical realism to investigate and interrogate both the contemporary movement and historical events. In the sense, Afrofuturism combines both postmodern and postcolonial philosophies. It was coined by Mark Derry in 1994 to describe the post-war aesthetic practices deployed by African-American artists who combined elements of African culture with American techno culture. Okay, so here we're going to speak a little bit more about Black Panther. One of the key features of postmodernism is that it was formed in and negotiates the way through the information age using cross-continental communication and technology. Afrofuturism combines science fiction, technology, and culture to imagine a techno-African future. Black Panther is a film based on the Marvel graphic novel and set in the fictional African nation of Wakanda. The film drew on Afrofuturism in its design and aesthetic. Okay, so it used this concept when the film was being created. So let's turn now to post-culturalism, where we will talk a little bit more about this idea of the Rainbow Nation. So post-cultural thought is a reaction to liberal humanist ideas about the self as a fixed, whole, and rational. So remember, we talked about structuralism, where we define things in terms of structures. Post-structuralists reject the idea of a self as a unified and whole, arguing that the self is constructed through various conversations with the surrounding world. Okay, so post-structuralism was contradictory to structuralism. Post-structuralism considers language as the medium through which we navigate structure and experience our world. So the main idea in post-structuralism is that we navigate our world and create our social reality through language. Things such as tables, chairs, or other objects which make up our physical reality, and actions do not contain meaning in themselves, but rather obtain meaning through language. The word table is not a table. Post-structuralism, like postmodernism and post-feminism, is difficult to define because it incorporates a range of philosophies and resists a single definition. However, in simple terms, at the heart of post-structural thought is the idea that social reality is produced by language, and this varies across cultures and across time. So, structuralism, which remember came before post-structuralism, described the world in terms of a structured logic, a structure to where things were created. They viewed individual objects as inevitably belonging to a larger whole. Structuralism emphasizes structures and processes that inform the construction of social reality and the way we interact. Language was seen as a key which allows us to unlock the creation and construction of meaning in our everyday lives. Meaning can be found within the text which was created, which was by nature created in a logical and unified way. Texts refer not only to actual written texts, but to the narratives that made sense in situations, objects, and actions. Questions? Okay, so structuralism is rule-based, organized, and attempts to apply a rational order to the world. And post-structuralism is contradictory to this. I just want you guys to understand this theory. That's why I'm relating it to post-structuralism. Post-structural thinkers challenge the idea that words have structured meaning. Okay, this particular post-structuralist, Jacques Derrida, he did this by suggesting that meaning could be found in the differences between concepts within the structure of language itself, and that these concepts could contain multiple meanings. Post-structuralism rejects the structuralist idea of an underlying and defined system that can explain how the world works. They place even more importance on the idea that language constructs our reality. Unlike the structuralists, however, post-structuralists view language as unstable and constantly changing. So we see that structuralism was structured as it says, but post-structuralism was evolving, it was changing, it was contradictory to the initial theory. So what about post-structuralism and South Africa? The idea of the Rainbow Nation came into popularity by Desmond Tutu to describe a newly formed democratic South Africa characterized by its multicultural, multiracial, and multilingual social and political landscape. Post-structuralists argue that identities are made and remade through discourse, and the discourse of the Rainbow Nation was one that attempted to strengthen a unified South Africa's national identity. So here we were looking at, it was diverse, it was progressive, okay, and this was our culture that was forming. The idea of the Rainbow Nation contained the promise of the future, as well as describing a newly shaped present that included people from every part of the country, regardless of class, race, gender, or cultural practices. Although South Africa has come a long way since the end of apartheid, many argue that the idea of the Rainbow Nation is a myth designed to promote a false sense of national identity in a country that remains divided in many ways. The idea of the Rainbow Nation, not unlike similar nation-building ideas elsewhere in the world, such as the American Dream, is intended to act as a master narrative, a universal idea that is told through a single narrative of development and that attempts to provide a cohesive shared identity for a diverse population. So they use this term for nation building, okay, to create a sense of belonging and to have some form of pride in who we are. And it strengthens, or it should strengthen, the identity of the nation. So post-structuralism challenges the idea that some narratives, such as the narrative of the Rainbow Nation, are more important or powerful than others, or that one story or description of a country's social political state is the true master narrative that defines everything. This is important for our understanding of how narratives and ideas work in society. In recent commentary, the idea of the Rainbow Nation is being challenged because of the lingering effects of apartheid that prevent the ideal of a fair and equal and progressive society from being realized, which I did speak a little bit about. There's still Europeanism in our education, for example. Okay, there are these statues that were still lingering around in South Africa that were statues of people that were oppressive towards African people. So can the idea of the Rainbow Nation be realized when we still have all these factors that we need to take into consideration? In a study conducted in 2007, the South African Regional Poverty Network reported that 24% of the South African population earned below the poverty line. Most of the country is still subject to low quality healthcare and education. Racial inequality still persists, with the majority of Black population holding very little of the country's wealth. So this is what I was talking about. And now you can think to yourself, is this idea of the Rainbow Nation realized with all these factors being taken into account? What do you think, Maki?
No, it's not realized.
Exactly. Okay, so it's a nice idea, but when we dissect it a little bit more, we come to understand that it's not realized. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about post-feminism. We're on pages 115. So the post in post-feminism is somewhat misleading, as it can suggest that feminist movements before the age of post-feminism had attained their goals of true economic, social, and political gender equality, which it was not realized. However, the number of global movements—
Sorry, ma'am.
Yeah?
Can you please repeat that line again, the post, because I'm trying to understand it, but I think you just went a bit too quick.
So what they're basically saying is that the post in post-feminism, it's misleading. Okay, so it means that there was some kind of goal that we actually attained. We did attain something, but it's not actually true. So here it says, it can suggest, so it's suggestive that feminist movements before the age of post-feminism had attained their goals of true economic, social, and political gender equality. So had they attained their goals?
Okay. No, I understand now, because post-feminism is like the new version of feminism, because they are saying that feminism had already reached its goals. So it's saying it's misleading.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes, good. So, however, the number of global movements that continue to fight for women's rights suggests that this is not the case. So, for example, the Me Too movement provokes conversations about sexual harassment and gender violence, about the fact that more South African women live in poverty than South African men, and the reality that there is a lack of equal access to reproductive healthcare worldwide. The term post-feminism reflects a dissatisfaction with previous feminist movements as a myth designed to convince women of their freedom, when in reality there is still a lot to do in the fight for gender equality. One of the central arguments in that post-feminism makes is that prior feminist thought is now inadequate to describe the challenges that women face in society. In this view, feminism needs to be extended to reflect changing cultural and socioeconomic conditions. So previously we had an idea of what feminism was, Now we need to think of various other factors such as class and race and cultural and socioeconomic conditions. Okay. So there are many, many, many different things that we need to think about in post-feminism theory.
Ma'am,
Yes.
before you change the slide, I just want to ask then, so since you say most of these concepts contradict each other, how is post-feminism contradicting feminism?
It's not contradictory. So I'm not going to, so let me just correct myself, not all. So some of the theories do, contradict each other, and others build up upon the previous ones. So this is, we found that modernism and postmodernism, it was contradictory. Structuralism and post-structuralism, it was contradictory. In feminism, it builds up on. And there's a little bit of change, okay? So there's various other factors that we need to take into consideration when it comes to post-feminism, okay?
So ma'am, so in the second last point, the third last point, when it says it reflects a dissatisfaction with previous feminist movements, what does that mean as a myth?
Okay, so it just basically means that they were not happy with the amount of work that was done in the progression of feminist ideas and ideology. Okay, so here we are saying that women are free, but to what extent are they really free?
Okay.
Yeah, there's still a lot of work to do. That's basically what they're saying. So it means that we need to continue the fight for feminism quite strongly.
Okay.
So feminism has been described as happening in 3 waves. First wave feminism occurred during the 19th and early 20th century and was focused on legal and social issues with various societies. It was primarily a fight for women's right to vote and was therefore referred to as a women's suffrage movement. So initially, that's what it was. Notably, the movement was problematic as that it did not take into account the contentious race and class politics of the time. Okay, did it look at the fact of how rich or poor women were? Did it look at the different races? No. So notably the most problematic, okay, I spoke about that. Second wave feminism, which can be tracked back to the period after the Second World War, focused on the workplace, sexuality, and reproductive rights. So here we're looking at feminism through the ages. Although second wave feminism has been widely critiqued for its focus on predominantly white, middle-class concerns, many women who contributed to the second wave were also participants in the Black civil rights movement in the US, together with other minority groups fighting for freedom and emancipation. Questions, comments? Okay, so third wave feminism, which began in the 1990s and is still in effect today, is comprised of multiple feminist outlooks, including ecofeminism and intersectional feminism. Ecofeminism is a movement that draws connections between the exploitation of the Earth's natural resources and the exploitation of women. Intersectional feminism is a movement that argues for the recognition that different women experience different levels of oppression in society, and that this difference is often determined by race, class, sexual, or combination of these. Yes, and this is very true. Not all women are treated the same.
But ma'am,
Yeah.
Ecofeminism, the exploitation of nature and women, like why? Like how does that have?
Sorry, let me just talk about this ecofeminism a little bit. So remember, I want to bring up an example of Africa, okay? For example, in Africa, are women allowed to own land? Who controls the deeds of the land in most African countries?
Oh, okay. Males. I mean,
Yes.
what?
Yeah. Okay. So it means that men control the resources. Women are just there to do the menial work. They cannot be owners or producers of the land, etc. Okay. Does it make sense to you?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. So post-feminism first appeared as a concept in the 1990s and has been described as marking a divide between old ways of thinking about women's rights and the new ways of thinking about women's rights. Anne Brooks writes that the term post-feminism can be understood as a useful concept of reference encompassing the intersection of feminism with a number of other anti-foundational movements, including postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-colonialism. Brooks further argues that the prefix post in post-feminism does not refer to a moving beyond or negation of previous movements, but rather a process of ongoing transformation and change. In this understanding of this term, post-feminism shares certain concerns and positions with third wave feminism. Postmodernism provides fertile ground for the growth of the post-feminist movement, particularly in its celebration of difference and refusal of grand narratives. The post-feminist woman is characterized as strong and independent, characteristics that have found their way into marketing strategies in popular media. While these characteristics are not in themselves negative, they function as marketing tools, situates them within the realm of consumerism and consumer culture. In other words, the media presents an image of what a strong, independent woman looks like, and then promotes the consumer products that will enable a woman to embody this persona. Women are encouraged to associate certain brands or consumer goods with the characteristics of a strong, independent woman. Yes, we hardly find it where in today's times where weakness is promoted in any form, especially when it comes to feminism for some reason. Okay, and it can become quite controversial in the sense as women are not allowed to show their weakness. So post-feminism boldly claims that women possess an active political agency and subjectivity. Yet the primary place in which this agency is recognized and legitimized is within individual consumptual habits as well as within the general consumer culture. Okay, so we generally find it in consumer culture, where we buy products and things. What this means is, though, although contemporary media representations of women can be seen as more positive, they can also be viewed as aggressive marketing strategies designed to increase consumerism, rather than indicators of social or political changes with gender relations. Have you seen that, or do you see that in society? What are your thoughts about that?
I agree with the paragraphs, man. You see it a lot on the adverts, like whether it's makeup and stuff for let's say darker looking women and stuff. It's like, yeah, it's in your face now.
Yeah, so we see it a lot in consumerist culture, but we don't know, is it fully being realized in the workplace, in the political realm? Are women getting the same salary as men for the same work, etc., etc.? Okay, so that's what we need to consider when we consider the idea of post-feminism. Okay, so one of the effects of post-feminism in the media was a sexualization of culture evident in a growing preoccupation with sexual practices and desires, identities, and the emergence of new types of sexual experiences. Post-feminism signals a shift from objectivization to subjectivization. Objectivization, and especially sexual objectivization of women, occurs when women are treated as mere objects or things that exist solely for the pleasure of men. Subjectivization occurs when someone makes up their own mind about something according to their personal taste, interests, or desires. In this way, some media goes from objectifying women's sexuality for the benefit of men to showing women that embrace their sexuality for themselves. Yes, and this has been a big deal for women. So what about post-feminism in South Africa? We're almost done with the lecture. The idea of post-feminism appeared in the 1990s, a decade that also saw the transition of South Africa into a democracy and greater racial equality. It also included in the new version of the New South Africa and was a movement toward greater gender equality, reflected in the incorporation of key elements of the Women's Charter in the New South African Constitution of the Bill of Rights. During the apartheid era in South Africa, the media was subject to censorship and suppression. After apartheid, the media was freed from these restraints and entered the global sphere of advertising and media campaigns. The post-feminist image of femininity that it permeated the international media market was imported to South Africa through global advertising. Okay, so we see some of these existence of adverts where post-feminist thinking was permeated into South Africa. Questions, comments? Okay, so we see that we have to look at various certain theories, even when it comes to understanding South African culture and media and the culture. Okay, we're going to talk more about subcultures in the next lecture and what subcultures are. Okay, it's a very interesting concept that you can look at. And we will see each other next week. Same time, same place. Are there any questions or comments about today's lecture or about the assessment that you want to ask me? Just out of curiosity, did everyone get their marks for the first assessment?
No, ma'am, not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, no, ma'am.
Okay, not yet. Okay. Okay. So yeah, thanks for letting me know. And I will speak to you guys next week. Next week, Monday is a holiday, am I right? I think. Let me just check.
Next week, Wednesday.
No, this week, Wednesday, and next week, Monday. So remember, the first is a holiday, so the second will be a holiday. So next week, we won't have our class on a Monday. It will only be on a Friday. And then you can also attend Varna, which is the other lecturers' sessions. Okay, so this week, Wednesday, and next week, Monday are holidays.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Get well.
Thanks. I don't know. I hope I don't have COVID. Maybe it's just my throat because it was like so scratchy last night, but I hope it's not COVID. Okay, everybody, see you guys. Sorry?
You mustn't drink. I'm saying you mustn't drink cold water. You must only drink hot stuff for today, man.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Thanks so much, Maki. Thanks a lot. Okay, guys, remember, any questions about the assessment, please send me an email, guys. Okay, I want you guys to do better in the second one. Remember quotation marks for anything that is not your own words. Okay. Okay, see you guys next week. Have a great week further.
Bye, man.
Bye.